Is back with us. Puneet, you heard the ambassador there, soft but very firm and very candid in what's happening on ground. Is this encouraging news if there is a crackdown that's happening, or would you like to see more done?
So, Namaste Anand, and
Namaste.
I would like to congratulate you that Trudeau has finally left our country. And now coming back to the question, I think there are three aspects of it. Like first is like this Khalistanis, and this Canada, and then India, right? There are three. So these Khalistanis, they are basically, first you have to understand you cannot deal with them because they are people driven by an ideology, right? So they are thugs, they are criminals or whatever. And the thing is, when you talk about politicians, I think now they have infiltrated the system so deeply that actually that they are weighing the politicians, then politicians supporting them. To give you an example, the biggest tragedy that happened in Canadian history is this Air India bombing, right? So I was telling you before, like no politicians openly says about it, so much so that 80% of people, Canadian population doesn't know much about it. And if they have to say, for example, the guy who is opposing Justin Trudeau, Pierre Poilievre, who is probably going to be the next prime minister, if he has to say something like, for example, he opposes this, tableau of Mrs. Gandhi being paraded, being shot, he doesn't say it on Twitter, but he hides on his website. So the politicians in Canada are just like terrified, and the envoy has security, and like he will go back. But a person who is living in Canada, just imagine an ordinary person. Like, what can you do against these goons? So it's basically a complete mafia who have held the population hostage. And I don't see actually this resolving anytime soon. So what the Indian government has finally done is taken a firm stand. And, they have connected all these things. They are into gang crimes. They are into immigration fraud and all these things. So that is all very welcome. But I think we need to do more. For example, who is wagging all these things, Trudeau and all, is WSO.
Correct.
Who has basically, submitted lies to the inquiry that was looking into Air India bombing? WSO. Who was supporting this? Indian government should basically declare like a proscribed organization. And that will also push, because Canada is not going to act by itself because they are so terrified of them. But if the Indian government pushes that as a proscribed organization, then it may act. And there is also here, I'll give you one point. You see this Air India bombers, they bombed the plane in 1985, right? Yeah. Their inquiry said, okay, Babbar Khalsa is responsible behind. But do you know, Canada is such an easygoing country that they didn't ban Babbar Khalsa. When it was banned after September 11. When the Americans said, now we have to get serious about terrorism. And this Babbar Khalsa, then Canada was like, oh, yes. So they bombed the place in 85. The Canadians' investigation said, yes, this has happened. But they banned Babbar Khalsa only in 2002, after September 11. So this is what we have to bring international pressure against these Khalistani groups, and then Canada may act, because that is the history. They don't act by themselves.
कुछ देश होते हैं जो दूसरों से डिक्टेशन लेते हैं. That's there. So it's a reality. But Terry Malisk is also with us. You have written about the Global Khalistan project. So where is this going, and where would you believe the strands actually lie, and why is it that they're having a field day in Canada? That's the perception.
Because Canada allows it. That's the problem. Canada has not taken it seriously. They didn't take the warnings of the attack on Air India seriously 40 years ago, and they didn't take it seriously in 2018 when Prime Minister Trudeau had his first visit to India, which ended in a fiasco, whereas you'll recall a convicted Khalistani terrorist was amazingly enough invited to dine at the High Commissioner's dinner for the Trudeaus in New Delhi, which just shocked and appalled the Indian government, as it should have, and embarrassed the Prime Minister. You'd think they would have got the message then, but no, they didn't. The problem, as I say, is that Canada allows what should not be allowed. They do not make a distinction in Canadian law between what we would all agree is free speech. You can go down the street waving a flag and saying Khalistan Zindabad. I don't have any problem with that. I'm in favor of free speech. But when it crosses the line into the incitement of violence, when you picture the High Commissioner who was just with you, when you put up his picture and his name and you say, this man is a killer, and you parade these posters through the streets of Canada in Toronto and Vancouver, what happens when some young nut with a knife or a gun gets that message? And we're very close to that point. There has been prodigious violence, incredible violence in the past, and this feels to me a lot like the 80s. I was there in the 80s. I covered the Air India bombing. It feels to me like the 80s when there were these hysterical cries for action by Khalistani fighters, and we don't want to see that happen. We don't want to see these threats come true. But to date, even after the confrontation between, and I think it was, you can call it a confrontation rather than a meeting between Modi and Trudeau, I do not see anything happening on the Canadian side to do, for example, what Rishi Sunak did for the British, to say, look, we're not going to allow any space for this kind of extremism in Britain. Now, they've already banned, for example, in Britain, 17 years ago, they banned the glorification of terrorism. What do you call it when you parade through the streets of Toronto with a truck with a life-size reenactment celebrating the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984? What do you call it when you have these posters all over the country putting targets on the backs of Indian diplomats? What do you call it when you put up martyr posters of the Air India bomber, Dalvinder Parmar, the worst mass murderer in Canadian history, and you treat him like he's a model for Sikh youth, a great man, a hero, a martyr, a shaheed of the Sikh nation? Well, until Canada gets serious about drawing a line, saying that you don't cross that line, where you incite violence, where you glorify terrorism, that's on the other side of the law. Until we do something about that, we're doing nothing.